Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
Talli's been a pretty long break between our last show and this, longer than usual, certainly.
Well, we both got sick.
And then after I got sick, you traveled. You went to New York for a conference.
Nefesh conference.
How was that?
It was great. Nefesh is an organization of Orthodox mental health professionals. So there's a lot of rabbis there and a lot of Hasidim walking around there. And there are a lot of psychologists and therapists. And David Ribner and I presented our book. And I talked there about the concept of pleasure, and that's going to be our topic for today as well.
You also mentioned that a lot of people there said they listened to the podcast, which is nice.
Yeah, that's great. We love the diversity in our audience.
Talli, when you first mentioned to me that you wanted to talk about sex for pleasure, I thought that was a great idea. Tell me about the genesis of the idea. Why do you want to talk about this idea specifically?
Well, one of our fans, who always has something nice to say as well as some criticism, gave me some very important feedback. And she said, you know, your podcast is like learning all about Pesach, but only talking about the maror, only talking about the bitter herbs. She said, people don't want to just hear about problems. People want to hear about sex as an activity that is pleasurable and that provides enjoyment. Why are you always talking about the problems? That's why today we're going to talk about pleasure.
Whether it's praise or criticism, we always appreciate hearing from our audience. Before we delve into today's topic, we want to thank everybody out there for listening to Intimate Judaism. We appreciate your sharing and promoting this podcast. We're really excited. This podcast has continued to grow. November, in fact, Talli, was by far our biggest month yet in terms of total listens. And with your help, we'll continue to help people all over the world open conversations about intimacy, sexuality, and Judaism. Make sure to visit our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikvah list, and more. Some people have asked how they can help us with this podcast, and let me give you 3 options. First of all, tell people about the podcast. Second, please share it on Facebook, Twitter, or any other way you think might work. And third, soon, Talli and I will be opening a Patreon site where you can support this podcast financially, whether a lot or a little, as well as get some cool free stuff, extra episodes, and more. So stay tuned. That's coming pretty soon. Please continue to send us your questions, comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Every one of your comments is always appreciated by both Talli and me. Please understand, however, we get a lot of email, and while we do read everything, we can't always respond to everybody. So please understand, we certainly are reading everything, and if we don't respond, we will try, but we can't promise to answer everybody right away.
We have several types of emails that are sent to us. Generally, to the Intimate Judaism email address, we will get emails with feedback, and we really appreciate that. But I also, and I'm sure you have as well, Scott, I've had many people reach out to me with their personal issues and questions. If you are going to email me, or if you do want to get in touch with me personally and want to talk to me about whatever issue you have or want advice, please put Intimate Judaism in the subject so that I'll know that that's where you are coming to me from listening to one of our episodes. I recently launched a new website, www.tallirosenbaum.com, and I also would ask for listeners who are interested in my newsletters to please sign up for my newsletters. I know that there are many listeners who work with couples and who are rabbis and Kala instructors and therapists, as well as lay people. And I would like to announce an upcoming course that I have coordinated for practitioners, for people who would like to improve their skills in sex therapy. So that's what I have for professionals, but I also have a lot of resources on my online store for couples. One of the programs that I'm selling is a video course called Secrets, which has been developed by my colleague, Abby Weiss, and I'm going to be selling it for her on my site. So please visit my online store and sign up for my newsletter.
And while we're at it, Talli, let me also put in a shameless plug for my own website, jewishcoffeehouse.com, which has a lot of great podcasts, including, of course, Intimate Judaism, and which we're currently renovating for relaunch on January 1st, 2020. That's coming up very soon. So please take a look. specifically if it's January 1st or later.
One more reminder, my book with David Ribner called I Am for My Beloved, A Guide to Enhanced Intimacy for Married Couples, has been available for about a month or so in Israel and will be available as of January 1st on Amazon.com.
And I believe our next episode will be my interviewing the two of you and David, about that book. So
yeah, I look forward to that next month.
And of course, people will be able to purchase that book as well at that time on our website, intimatejudaism.com. Let's go into today's topic, and I'll begin, Talli, by looking at some basic sources indicating Judaism's overall attitude towards sex and sexuality as it pertains to pleasure. Let me preface it with 3 caveats. The first one is that Torah literature is multivocal when it comes to this topic. I would be misleading all of our listeners if I pretended that all passages equally emphasize the glory of sexual pleasure per se. There are multiple strands within tradition, and I'm going to be speaking about one of them, the one that emphasizes sexual pleasure. The second point is that within this trend, which sees sex with pleasure as a positive and wonderful thing, this is universally true, assuming sex is performed within the guidelines of halacha, most obviously within marriage, and assuming the couple is not in a state of nida. So that's just to put it out there before anyone questions that particular point. And finally, I could quote many, many sources, far more than I'm going to within this strand of tradition. I'm only going to present a small and representative sample, not because it's an exhaustive list, but because it's representative of a certain way of thinking. I'm sure that many of our listeners will be able to quote other sources as well, and that's fine. I'm not pretending to offer a comprehensive overview. So let's get into it. And there's a general rule which I always find useful, which is that the first place something appears in the Torah often represents its ultimate expression. And the first place we explicitly see sexual activity among human beings in the Torah, apart from the general command to be fruitful and multiply, which appears in the first parak of Breshit, is in Breshit Parak Daled, Pasuk Aleph, immediately after the story of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, where it says, V'ha'adam yada et Chava ishto. Adam knew, the famous biblical knowing, had intercourse with his wife Chava. And this teaches 2 things. The first is pointed out by Rashi. The fact that it's phrased in this way, V'ha'adam yada, indicates that this sexual activity between Adam and Eve took place before the events of Gan Eden, before the sin of the tree of knowledge. Unlike certain common assumptions, particularly in other religions, the carnal desire is not a result of sin. Carnal desire was there before sin. So it's not as though original sin brought sexual pleasure into the world as a negative. Rashi's pointing out very much based on the grammar of the Pasuk that Adam and Eve had intercourse and gave birth before any of the events of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. So sexual pleasure is brought into the world in the Garden of Eden as a good thing before anything bad took place.
So the original sin, quote unquote, had nothing to do with having sex.
Certainly according to Rashi's reading, and he's reading it based on the grammar. And the second point I want to point out about this particular pasuk is the word yada. The fact that intercourse in the Torah is also the same word as knowing, as knowledge. Knowledge is unquestionably a positive term. Rav Soloveitchik himself argues that the fact that knowledge, da'at, is the term used for sex, indicates that's one of the highest values of Judaism. As we know in the Amidah, the weekday Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, the very first request we have is for de'ah, for knowledge. That indicates how important it is, and the fact that intercourse is called de'ah shows that it itself is a strong positive idea. Now, where's the first place in the Torah? In fact, it might be the only place in the whole Torah where we actually see sex for pleasure rather than sex as part of procreation or simply as a function of marriage. The first place, and mainly the only place we really see it, is somewhat surprising when you think about the characters in the Torah. It is in Parshat Toldot, in Parak Kaf Vav, Pasuk Chet, 26:8. That is where we see Yitzchak and Rivka. It says he's mitzachek. It means, obviously, in the context, he was having sexual intercourse with his wife. He was doing something sexual with her over there. And this was not in the context of getting married, like we see with Yaakov and Rachel. This was not in the context of having children. This is purely sex, and the word mitzachek implies for fun. And that seems to be quite clear. That is what was going on.
And it doesn't necessarily have to have been sex. It could have been flirting or playing.
Absolutely.
Having fun with each other.
It was something which made it absolutely clear they were husband and wife. That much is clear from the text itself. But what's fascinating is that the person who's involved in this is the person who's the olat tmima, the sacrifice, the person who's often considered the holiest, most spiritual of all of the ancestors, Yitzchak. And yet at the same time, he's the one who's presented as having fun with his wife. And it's not presented in any context other than enjoying his wife's company in a sexual way. Now, this is true from biblical narrative, but the idea of sex as pleasure also appears and is codified in halacha as well, most specifically in Shmot, Perek Kaf Aleph, Pasuk Yud, where it says, She'era k'tuta v'onata lo yigra. It's actually an argument between Rashi and Ramban which word refers to what, but it's understood that either she'era or onata means that a husband is obligated to give his wife sexual pleasure. This is not the mitzvah of be fruitful and multiply, pruruvu. This is the mitzvah of satisfying his wife sexually. And that implies pleasure. That's certainly the way it's understood according to what I believe is the simple pshat. Now, the frequency of sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife, again, for the mitzvat onan, we're not talking about having children, is codified in Masechet Ketuvot, in Perek Hey, Mishnah Vav 5-6. I'd like to read a line from the Gemara on this, in Ketuvot, Daf Samach Bet Amud Bet. It says there, Ona shel Talmidei Chachamim emat, when should Talmidei Chachamim have intercourse with their wives? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Me'erev Shabbat le'erev Shabbat. They should have it on Friday nights. Asher Pirio Yitain Bito, which gives its fruit in its time. That's a quote from Tehillim Perek Aleph. Amar Rav Yehuda v'Teimer Rav Huna v'Teimer Rav Nachman. Zeh hamashamesh mitato me'erev Shabbat le'erev Shabbat. These rabbis, one of them, it's unclear which one, said, this pasuk refers to a person who has intercourse on Friday nights. I want to point out what Rashi says there. Rashi says, why Friday night? Shehu leil ta'anug ushvita v'hana'at haguf. That is the night of enjoyment and rest and pleasure for the body. I'm quoting the Gemara and Rashi's commentary in order to emphasize that this is saying sex done weekly should specifically happen on a day dedicated to physical pleasure. Once again, Shabbat, even though we often think of it as a day of spirit, and it certainly is, it says in the Gemara that what is the nefesh or the neshama yetera? It is actually something which causes you to have more physical enjoyment on that day. Rashi says it means you want to eat more and sleep more. Shabbat is a day of physical enjoyment. The fact that the Gemara says that the mitzvah of sexual pleasure takes place on Friday night is all part of this general idea that sex should be pleasurable, so it should be on the most pleasurable night of the week. Now let me quote Rav Moshe Feinstein. He says in Igrot Moshe in Even HaEzer, part 3, question 28, and it's actually on page 453 for those who want to look it up. Ulaniyut dati, by my humble opinion, haya nireh, it seems, dikar ha'ona hu b'sha'a shoreh habal shehi mishtokeket el ba'ala. The main mitzvah of ona, of having sexual pleasure, of a husband satisfying his wife sexually, is when the husband sees that she has a desire for her husband. That's why it says in Masechet Pesachim, the name of Rava, on page 72, Chayav Adam l'samech et ishto bidvar mitzvah. A man is required to give joy to his wife with a matter of mitzvah, which means sexually. Sheperish Rashi, and Perish Rashi says there, Afilu shlo bishat onata. This goes beyond what it says in Masechet Ketuvot in the Mishnah. It's not only at the obligated times, it actually means whenever she wants it. Whenever she has a desire for pleasure, the husband has an obligation to provide it for her. Rav Moshe Feinstein continues on the next page, Al kol panim, kevan dechazinan, shema she'isha mitavet mishtokeket, osach yuv ona midoraita. In any case, since we've seen that the woman's desire, the wife's desire and yearning for her husband creates an obligation by the Torah for the husband to have sex with his wife, mistaver shu ikar chiyuv ha'onah shebetorah. It makes sense that this is the primary obligation in the Torah, that when the wife wants it, the husband should provide it. We don't have to get into the inequality here, who this is more in favor of, the wife or the husband right now. The point is, though, that when she desires it, when she wants pleasure, that is what is koveya. That's what creates the obligation. If she wants to have sexual pleasure, the husband is required to provide it for her. One final source, Talli, and then I'll turn the microphone over to you. Rav Soloveitchik, in an essay entitled The Redemption of Sexual Life, in his book Family Redeemed, writes, this eternal quest of the unique lonely individual to flee his solitude and to share his personal existence with others, finds fulfillment via a carnal medium. God somehow employs the flesh as the instrument of his will in order to enable a metaphysical craving to become a reality. So the Rav is saying that sexual drive, apart from its procreative function, is a gift from God in order to allow human beings to overcome their natural loneliness and instead live in communion with others. This is obviously talking about the intimacy that comes from the mutual act of sexual pleasure. I think that's quite clear. I want to make one final reference here to Rabbi Dov Linzer, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva Chovevei Torah. He's also the co-host of the Joy of Text podcast. He wrote an excellent article that I found when I was doing research for this podcast. You can find it online. It's entitled Two Approaches to Marital Sex. It's from December 2009, and it contains what I think is a fine discussion of these two approaches. I mentioned one of them, the approach of sexual pleasure, but there's also the approach which is more ascetic in nature, represented by the Rambam, and more specifically, Rabbi Linzer explains that Rav Moshe Feinstein is representative of the track which I have been mentioning, and Rav Chaim Ozer Gredinsky, one of the great Gedolim from about a century ago, he died right around the beginning of World War II, he's representative of the more ascetic stream within Judaism. That's my introduction from a halachic and textual perspective of certainly what I believe is a strong element of a desire for sexual pleasure within a marriage in Judaism.
Wow, thanks for that. I think that was a fantastic review of the sources.
Thank you.
And so many different things come to mind about the different things that you said. I don't know where to begin. First of all, regarding the Rashi about having this devoted, contained space for pleasure, which is Shabbat. It got me thinking about one of the Zmirot. There's one Zemer in Lihit Aneg B'Tanugim, which is really about Oneg, which means pleasure. There's one that talks about V'hashena mishubachat kedat nefesh meshivat b'chei nafshi lecha arga v'lanuach b'chibat kashoshanim suga bo yanuchu benuvat. And in those words, especially nafshi lecha arga, my soul to you longs, that does feel very erotic in a sense, as though this paragraph is really about that particular engagement.
For sure. And there's even more erotic Zmirot. If you want to look at Yedid Nefesh, that is extraordinarily erotic. Now, admittedly, it's not talking about the love between a husband and a wife. It's talking about the love between God and the people of Israel. The imagery, however, is very, very intimate. And many Mekubalim, many people from the Kabbalistic stream of thought, emphasize sexual intercourse on Shabbos, not so much because of the pleasure aspect, but because it's almost a mirroring of spiritual processes that are happening in the Shamayim, in the heavens above, that in the same way that there's some sort of coupling, whatever that means, on a spiritual level, a husband and wife on Shabbat should mirror that down here. So the Zmirot of Shabbat and even some of the tefillot in Shabbat, sometimes obliquely, refer to this as well. Absolutely.
I think that also, when we talk about pleasure, sexual pleasure is a type of pleasure, but there is something very sensual in everything around the Shabbat, the special foods, the way that the table is laid out, the beautiful shining silver when we think in our heads of a Shabbat table. And then even Havdalah, which is also very sensual. We smell the cloves or whatever, and we even say a blessing on the smell.
You could even take it further if you want to go and sort of link it back to what I was saying earlier. The Yerushalmi says, why is the Havdalah bracha in the Amidah mentioned in the bracha of Da'at? Because there can't be separation without knowledge. But once again, that concept of knowledge, as we see, is a bit of a double entendre, because knowledge also refers to intercourse.
Right.
What that means on a larger level, I'll leave it to our listeners to decide, but certainly you're right. There's a lot of imagery which has many meanings within it, and the idea of pleasure on Shabbat, sexual pleasure being one of the main forms of pleasure on Shabbat, is absolutely a real thing.
And so the idea of how pleasure is viewed makes me curious in terms of the history of which rabbis and the eras in which they lived, because what we know about pleasure is that it has many, many ramifications. You said that just like the Torah has multiple voices around pleasure, well, pleasure has multiple dimensions around it. Pleasure, certainly and especially sexual pleasure, and specifically female sexual pleasure, has a very different view depending on history. The Greek approach to pleasure is going to be very different than the Victorian era. And then, of course, in the modern era, specifically around 1960, when the contraceptive pill really changed the way sex was experienced, now that it no longer was specifically about procreation. Women could have sex without worrying about procreation. I think the idea of pleasure historically, culturally, religiously has been very variable over centuries. There are cultures which went so far as to circumcise women's bodies in order to avoid or disallow the experience of sexual pleasure. And there are books that have been written from a feminist angle about how men have for centuries repressed women's sexuality and sexual pleasure in order to control them. So there's really a lot of aspects.
And of course, historically, we know
about.
There's been a tremendous fear of female sexual pleasure. You can read books from a long time ago where people where men in particular, they were the ones writing the books, they would talk about with derision the nature of female sexual pleasure, that there's no way to satisfy a woman and that a woman's sexual drive is literally insatiable. It was just a way of looking at it, which was a very negative way of understanding it, especially compared to the way they understood men's sexual pleasure.
Exactly. I think that in the Greek culture, for example, any sort of pleasure was pleasure for its own sake and was referred to as hedonistic, whereas there were other, within the Greek culture, approaches which were more about pleasure for more of a motivation to do something rather than pleasure for its own sake. That's already Greek philosophy.
Right.
If we talk about the idea of male oppression, what you're describing about the derision towards female pleasure is very much a function of fear of women or misogyny, hatred of women. There's really a lot of literature on the idea of female pleasure. But what it appears is that the rabbis really saw women as wanting, needing, desiring, and that men should definitely provide it for them. And it's kind of interesting because very often, I actually had a Hasidic Chassan Rebbe ask me about this at the conference. He sat me down and he said, look, we have all these sources that talk about the need to provide pleasure, but all the men that I work with come back and tell me that their wives want to be mevater. They don't want it. They don't need it. It doesn't seem like what's happening on the ground really aligns with that.
It's interesting.
Yeah. I thought that was a very interesting comment. And I think that may also have to do with how we educate about pleasure. And that's really what I also want to be able to talk to.
I'll just make one comment before you continue, Talli. And obviously, I'm biased. I'm coming from a perspective of love and respect for our tradition. But one thing which I never noticed in my understanding of the sources is any sort of the fear that you mentioned that we see in other cultures, a fear of female sexual pleasure. At least from what I can tell, the prevailing attitude is that women have a right to sexual pleasure, rather than it being something which men should be afraid of. It's something which is it's owed to them on some level. That's at least my perspective. It seems to be quite different from many of the other cultures that you cited.
Well, I think that in many of the Aggadic or Midrashic stories in the Talmud, there is a recognition of the power of female sexuality on men.
For sure. No, that's for sure true. I just think it's absent necessarily the fear, even though the power and the passion of it is absolutely there and very, very clearly articulated.
So you were saying about Rav Soloveitchik.
You know, I have a tendency to cite him.
Yes, you sort of saw my eye roll there.
I did.
We cannot have a podcast without Rav Soloveitchik.
It will happen. It will happen. You
were talking about how Rav Soloveitchik talked about how pleasure or sex drive is a way, it enables a metaphysical way to overcome the natural state of loneliness. And in fact, what we understand about pleasure, even neurobiologically, is that the pleasure centers of the brain are connected with dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter, which provides motivation. In fact, pleasure is very much related to motivation. In fact, if we didn't have the experience of pleasure, we may not even be motivated to have sex because procreation in and of itself may not be enough of a reason. I think that God kind of knew what he was doing when he created men and women with the capacity for pleasure. And biologically, he created women with a clitoris, which is part of the anatomy, which has no function other than to provide pleasure for the
Well,
woman.
Dave Barry wrote a book, Babies and Other Hazards of Sex. So I think
Yes.
that's certainly what you're talking about.
Exactly. The thing that I want to say about pleasure, recently there was a conference in Mexico City of the 24th World Congress of the World Association for Sexual Health. And they came out with a position paper recognizing that sexual pleasure is a self-determined right. In other words, it is a human right for individuals to pursue pleasure, not at all costs, obviously, not at the cost of somebody else's autonomy or without consent. But sexual pleasure is a fundamental part of sexual rights as a matter of human rights. It includes the possibility of diverse sexual experiences. I'm just kind of reading from the paper. Sexual pleasure shall be integrated into education, health promotion, service delivery, research and advocacy in all parts of the world. All governments should be urged, international, intragovernment, and non-governmental organizations, to promote sexual pleasure in law and policy as a fundamental part of sexual health. And it goes on and on and on. And the idea being that the expectation for a sexual relationship or for sexual interaction without pleasure is really a non-sustainable expectation.
And I certainly think that's reasonable. In fact, I would argue that even the strain and the strand within Jewish tradition, which minimizes sexual pleasure as a fundamental motivator for sexual activity, the strand associated with Rav Chaim Ozer, as quoted in the article I mentioned, or the Rambam, I still think that they would agree that it's a right of sorts. For example, the Rambam certainly would say that if a wife is willing, a person should try to de-emphasize the number of times that he has intercourse with his wife. But that's the key point. It's with both of their agreement. It's a right of hers which she can forego. A right doesn't mean that it's something you have to do. It's rather something which, if they don't agree not to, someone has a right to it. However, if they don't want it, they don't have to do it. It's not an obligation. So the Rambam might say that it's something, a right, which it's better not to exercise. But it seems to me he would still argue that it is a right. For example, you mentioned female genital mutilation. Jewish sources, even those that are ascetic, do not approve of such a practice because there's an idea that pleasure should be there, even if it's not something which is the primary emphasis of what sex is about.
What we know about pleasure is that it's a very unique experience. People on an individual level will experience it differently. And if we're talking about the idea of pleasure on a macro level, then obviously people who will have comments on the idea of pleasure, those comments will be informed by their own individual, cultural, religious, social outlook. The Rambam was all about regulating and moderating and being abstinent of, and I think it definitely represents his worldview. On the other hand, there are likely other sages that felt differently about the idea of pleasure. As you said from Rav Linzer's article, there are two main approaches. We also know that there are certain sects of Hasidim that very much limit the idea of sexual pleasure.
I think it's fascinating, though, that the Rambam, who certainly is emblematic of the more ascetic strain, is also the same individual who is cited, such as in our last podcast, when saying what is allowed apart from vaginal penetration in the context of sex. And he's one of the more lenient authorities, saying you can do really whatever you want to do, and you should listen to our previous podcast to get more information about that. But these are in balance even within the ascetic strain. Even within those like the Rambam who have a somewhat negative understanding of human pleasure, he still would say that halachically, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It might be a higher level of chassidut, a level of piety where a person should try to minimize his pleasure. It's also a matter of, Talli, how we define pleasure. I don't think the Rambam is necessarily deriding pleasure per se. I think it's more that he says physical pleasure should be minimized and you should have more emotional or even on a higher level, intellectual pleasure. It also depends on what sort of pleasure you're talking about. He might say the physical pleasure is more animalistic, and therefore it's not as important and shouldn't be emphasized as much as a higher order form of pleasure.
I appreciate the distinction that you made from the Rambam between the physical pleasure and the more cognitive pleasure, because this is actually very much a recognized distinction. There is physical pleasure, which is the actual sensation of pleasure. And then there's also the idea of pleasure. You can have the actual experience of feeling pleasure, which is completely biological. It's based on sensations and neural pathways. And then you can also be motivated by the idea of what will come out of this. For example, you can get pleasure by seeing your partner have pleasure. You can get pleasure that you're doing the right thing, that you're doing what's expected. There's actual physiological pleasure, and then there's more cognitive pleasure. And this is true, first of all.
Are those different centers of the brain?
They are. It's actually interesting because what we know from the research is that there are individuals who can report having arousal and orgasm, but not necessarily experience pleasure, whereas other individuals may experience arousal and may experience a great deal of pleasure in a sexual interaction, but not necessarily have orgasm. So it's important to note that pleasure is a far broader concept than just the idea of physiological arousal. In fact, even in the bodily changes that men and women experience, there are certain changes that women experience in sexual arousal, lubrication, or that kind of thing. There are women who will feel lubrication but not feel necessarily arousal, and other women will feel a great deal of arousal but not become lubricated. So it's important to understand that distinction exists.
And the Rambam's just taking it perhaps to an even greater degree by saying it goes beyond different types of physical pleasure onto cognitive and emotional pleasure as well.
Exactly. So much of how we experience pleasure is also very subjective, and it can be based on our developmental process. If we were raised with a great deal of permission around pleasure, so a child who is taking a walk with his mother or his father, and the parent stops and says, "Oh, what a wonderful smell. Let's just stand and smell this great smell," or "Let's look at this beautiful sunset and take it in. It doesn't matter what it's about," or "Isn't this such a delicious ice cream cone? Let's eat it slowly and enjoy it." When a child is raised to appreciate pleasure for pleasure's sake, and there can also be a cognitive or spiritual aspect to it. Ma rabu ma'asecha Hashem, how great and wondrous are your creations, but it doesn't have to be. When there is an entitlement towards pleasure, an appreciation of pleasure, it's more likely that that individual will grow up to experience sexual pleasure in a positive way because there are positive associations. For some people, pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, can be very negative, especially if they've had a negative association or if there has been any kind of sexual abuse or negative experience of sexuality. And in fact, and this is important, for many young people, and we've talked about this in our past podcasts, especially our very first one we talked about masturbation, but because young men, and also to some extent young women, are so conflicted about their natural development of sexual desire and arousal, those pleasurable sensations are wired in with feelings of guilt and conflict, and they're not easy to necessarily transition into now it's okay the moment they get married.
It sounds like, if I understand correctly, that you're saying that simply growing up in an environment where pleasure, I'm not talking about sexual pleasure, but whatever form of pleasure it is, whether it's aesthetic pleasure or any other physical pleasure, is valued and validated, that itself is an opening towards a person having a greater appreciation for sexual pleasure, whereas the converse might be in a household where pleasure is simply de-emphasized, where we don't talk about how good the food tastes and we don't really emphasize the beautiful sunset. I'm not making a value judgment. I'm just talking about the way people are raised. they might not really have a value in pleasure, and that might translate into sexual pleasure as well, perhaps an inability to appreciate it or to experience it as much. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, but even more than that, in some households, pleasure might be very much devalued. Why are you sitting on the couch doing nothing? You should be doing something. You should always be performing, creating, achieving. But just sitting around and reading, relaxing is, in some households, something to be criticized for.
Well, certainly also with eating, that can happen a lot
Yeah.
for different reasons, where simply there's an emphasis because of body image or whatever else, or health, anything, that why are you enjoying this food so much? Stop enjoying food so much might be the larger message, and that could have negative ramifications even for sexual pleasure later on. Is that right?
I believe so. I believe so. When we educate around sexuality, we also need to be able to educate about pleasure. The thing about pleasure is that even when you were talking about lada'at as intercourse, and when you talk about sex, you often use the word intercourse to talk about sex, as if intercourse is what sex is about. And what the idea of pleasure enhancement is, it's about everything surrounding the erotic exchange, which is not just what's done in the bedroom. In other words, there's a concept called simmering. And simmering is where you're kind of keeping the passion on a low flame, and it can be throughout the day. What Rashi said before about having Friday night as the time for pleasure is kind of a contained way. It's like, it's very Jewish. You know, there's a time for everything. Simchat Torah, it's a time to be happy. Tisha B'Av is a time to be sad. You know, everything is appropriate in its time and place. On Purim, you can do whatever you want and go crazy. But on a regular day, you've got everything that's very structured. So the idea of confining and defining pleasure and containing it in its certain times and places makes sense in the Jewish concept. What I'm talking about is actually something far more fluid. The idea of simmering is that that passion is there all the time in a couple, in an erotic energy that takes place between them. So it's not just about, okay, we're going to have sex now, but that the way that they look at each other in the morning in the kitchen, or just in the middle of the day coming and sitting on your husband's lap and giving him a long kiss and just kind of letting it simmer. Many people come to me and say that they don't feel that they can do that because they're educated or their partners are educated in a very distinct understanding that sexual pleasure has a very distinct beginning, middle, and end. And that the idea of kind of simmering with arousal or pleasure that's not connected to, okay, we're going to have sexual intercourse right now, is not such a comfortable
Well, it's interesting because
idea.
the way you're describing simmering right now makes me think of the way you described Shabbat about 20 minutes ago. In other words, Shabbat itself is filled with these, what we call erotic images, this sort of general avira, an environment or an atmosphere in which what Rashi calls the moment of pleasure there, the leil ta'anug, the time of having this pleasure. It's not that suddenly you're going from 0 to 100 as soon as you get to the bedroom. The assumption would be that the entire night would be what you're calling simmering.
Right,
It's
so
preparing
exactly. It's
for
great.
it.
So like Wednesday night, you go to the supermarket, you buy all the ingredients. Thursday night, you're in the kitchen making the soup and chopping the vegetables. Friday, you're setting the table and you're putting on all the fancy dishes. And then by Shabbat, that's kind of the example that you're giving. I like it. But I think that my example sounded like more fun until you get to the Shabbat part.
I'm simply trying to argue that even in Rashi...
I like the way you put that. I
do think that Rashi probably means that this is the night of enjoyment, and that might be the culmination of it rather than a separate event within the night. It's something which, as you're calling simmering, you lead up to it.
At the risk of bringing some maror, some bitter herbs into this Pesach conversation, I do want to say the following, and I say this a lot to Kala and Chatan instructors, because they do a lot of the premarital sexual education in different groups. And many of the populations that I work with are very Haredi, and they don't really have very much knowledge of sexuality or exposure. And what I say is that it's really very important to talk about pleasure and to talk about female pleasure. Because if you only talk about sex in terms of the cognitive motivations, this is a mitzvah and it's something you have to do and it's important, then it's not going to be sustainable. And I do get a lot of clients who report that they were never really taught about the idea of pleasure or of satisfaction, and that they were taught to be motivated out of a sense of duty or obligation or of how important it is. And hopefully eventually they will learn to like it, but that wasn't provided as something that's necessary from the beginning.
Well, Talli, what's the ramification of that? What I mean is this. Obviously, I agree that that should be taught as part of the lessons that a Chatan and Kala learn. Part of their overall education should be a sexual education as well as a halachic education. But let's say it's not. Let's say they're taught that it's an obligation. Isn't it something which, on some level, they can sort of pick up on their own? They realize this is a pleasurable thing. Is there some reason why it's impeded by the way they were taught?
Yeah, there are many reasons why it would be impeded. First of all, lack of basic knowledge and education. I mean, this stuff doesn't just happen naturally, necessarily. Normally, you know about it, you learn about it because there are stimuli in the environment and you're exposed to things. There are couples that don't just figure it out on their own. If they don't have the basic information, they don't know the basic anatomy. Now, it's true that, I'll give you an example. When men are instructed in the mitzvah, there's an expectation that there will be some physiological changes that occur in order for them to perform the act of consummation. And they understand, they're taught what those physiological changes are. The women are also taught, the young ladies, what to expect in terms of the changing male anatomy, the erection and the ejaculation and the different aspects of the sexual function that occurs in men. Now, we know that that erection has to occur in order for penetrative intercourse to take place. But what also is important to know is that there needs to be physiological changes of arousal in women in order to facilitate this. And the women are told to use KY gel. They're not necessarily told, it's important for you to be aroused as well so that you'll be lubricated and this will help the act of intercourse to occur. There needs to be that understanding that there is a mutual process here, that there isn't one person getting pleasure with another person not having that experience. Even on a physiological level, we are designed, we are wired, we are created for these physiological changes to take place in order to facilitate a healthy and satisfactory physical experience together.
It's actually ironic because given what we mentioned earlier, that the halachic sources, especially D'Oraita on a Torah level, emphasize it's the women's right to pleasure rather than the man's. I would think that anecdotally, very often, if anything, women are taught the opposite, that you have to be there, as you wrote in that article, I am his vessel. You have to be there for your husband's pleasure so that he doesn't, God forbid, spill semen in some unlawful way. And that emphasizes that the woman's pleasure is not really the main factor. Her main factor is to be there as a vessel, as a conduit for the man's pleasure so that he doesn't do something that would be terrible. And then in some ways, that's actually pretty backwards. It's not the way it's really supposed to be.
Yeah, it's like somebody made some changes to the original texts.
If anything, I hope that this podcast can perhaps begin to be a corrective to some of those mistaken notions. The idea that sex should be pleasurable, and frankly, particularly for the wife, is something which is not just grounded in halacha, it's actually mandated by halacha. And as Rav Moshe Feinstein says, what is the mitzvah of onah, the mitzvah of having intercourse? It's whenever the wife has a desire for it.
I think I need to say one more thing. The other thing that happens is that there is almost a demand for pleasure, and you can't have pleasure when you're demanded to have pleasure. The idea that the man has to pleasure the wife, I think that we really should begin to look at things in a more mutual way. It's not easy for the man either to feel all of that anxiety to provide pleasure. And in many cultures, the woman is going to either fake it or feel that it's her duty or obligation to get pleasure in a way that's actually contradictory to the idea of autonomy and authenticity. In other words, she's going to be doing it because she has to for him, and that's not going to be really what having pleasure is all about. Men should also feel entitled and free enough to enhance their pleasure as well, and to last longer. It's okay. I think that many men go really quickly because they don't feel so comfortable basking in it for too long. And the truth is that the longer they are in a state of pleasure, the more likely their wives are going to experience more pleasure.
It's quite clear that communication is key. And whether we're talking about verbal communication or sexual communication, either way, a communication in which both partners are able to experience pleasure thereby is the ultimate manifestation of this concept of da'at. Going back to what we talked about at the beginning, the first word in the Torah used for intercourse, for sexual activity, is knowledge, is knowing each other, being able to communicate with each other. And if that's the ultimate form of communication, rather than one person talking and the other person sort of just being a receptacle, if both sides are using sex as a form of communication, I think that's the healthiest possibility for a married couple.
Yes, I agree.
Thank you all for listening to today's podcast. Once again, please send us your questions and comments to intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. For show notes from this show, as well as all of our podcasts, a full podcast archive, a free men's mikvah list, and more, go to intimatejudaism.com. Go to tallyrosenbaum.com and sign up for her newsletter. Please go to jewishcoffeehouse.com and you can read my blog starting on January 1st, along with lots of other great podcasts. With Talli Rosenbaum, I'm Scott Kahn. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.